Caleb Maupin, my favorite American commentator, is a journalist, a broadcaster, a speaker, and an analyst, and an author, and an all-round good egg. And he joins me now, I think, from New York City. Caleb, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Always a pleasure to see you. I think you were busy. You didn't hear my opening remarks, but I was saying that the only words that Joe Biden can be trusted to say now without stumbling are Putin's price hike and Putin's inflation. Is that nonsense? Cutting any ice, buttering any parsnips?
Of course it's nonsense. I mean, if you look at the facts, prices were rising long before things escalated in Ukraine. In addition to that, the primary driver, on top of the other factors, was the fact that he chose to escalate economic warfare against Russia, make it harder for Russia to export their grain, make it harder for Russia to export food onto the markets, make it harder for Russia to export natural gas. So on top of a situation where we already had a rise in food costs, we already had a rise in energy costs, Joe Biden then chose to use the crisis in Ukraine to compound it and make the situation even worse. And that's on Joe. That's not on Russia. So Russia is a convenient scapegoat for the White House. But at the end of the day, if you look at the economic data, the White House has a lot more complicity and blame on its hands than anything that could be said about Russia. Russia wants to export their grain. Russia wants to export their natural gas. The more natural gas they export, the more money they make. You know, they're not trying to deprive the world of it. They're not trying to deprive the world of grain. It's economic warfare from the United States, compounded by already pre-existing factors, which the Biden administration itself has made worse with their restrictions on drilling, with their issues regarding pushing organic farming, which has a much lower output in terms of crops than regular traditional farming that uses pesticides. The Biden administration has done a lot to make things worse, and now they're blaming it on Russia.
Well, I suppose the question is anybody fooled by Biden's false attribution of the reasons for these problems?
Well, the poll numbers certainly don't say that. I mean, if you look at the poll numbers, Joe Biden is wildly unpopular. You look at those stickers people are putting next to the gas tanks in the United States, the gas, the place that you go and pump your gas. They've got a sticker on there with Joe Biden that says, "I did that." Polls show Joe Biden is wildly unpopular. The only person who's less popular than Joe Biden seems to be Kamala Harris, his vice president, who would become president if he were to step down. So it seems like this is not a good time for the Democrats, and that's why they're beating the drums of the culture war. The Democrats are running on a platform of Roe versus Wade and abortion. They're running on a platform of gun control and gun control legislation. They're running on a platform of remember how bad January 6th was, remember how Donald Trump was. That's all they've got going for them, because so far the Democratic administration in the White House that was supposed to ride in on a white horse and save the day has been an utter disaster for the country in terms of living standards, in terms of dealing with COVID. Things have just objectively gotten worse in the United States, and everyone can see that.
Your comparison of the disastrous poll ratings of Joe Biden and the even worse of Kamala Harris reminded me of an old Private Eye cover back in the 1970s when Richard Nixon was standing behind Richard Nixon was Spyro Agnew, and Nixon is pointing at him, and in the speech bubble it says, "Nobody's going to shoot me with this guy next in line." And I suppose Biden, having the only person more unpopular than him as vice president, probably inures him, short of going completely gaga or, God forbid, passing away in the night, assures him of the remainder of this term. But isn't the reason why they're hyping up January 6th and the hearings because they may need to criminalize Donald Trump, convict him, and legally, through warfare, lawfare, keep him out of the next presidential race?
Oh, sure. And, to be fair, George, a lot of Americans do have questions about January 6th, but their questions aren't how bad is Donald Trump? Their questions are how was this allowed to happen? I've been at many protests in Washington, D.C. in my lifetime. And one thing I can guarantee you could not have ever happened at those protests was walking into the U.S. Capitol. I was, marching against the Iraq War when I was a teenager with hundreds of thousands of people. And there were so many guards around that Capitol building. I mean, you couldn't get close to it. So how is it that on January 6th, we understand that the doors were left open or simply, we had a situation where this crowd was able to force their way into the halls of Congress. Now, I have questions about how that happened. I doubt those questions are going to be answered in these congressional charades that we're about to see. This is going to be a lot of theater, a lot of bombast, a lot of, scare stories about how bad the Republicans are. But they're not answering real questions about how the Capitol Police and how the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security that we know had heavily infiltrated the QAnon circles, the Proud Boys and other groups. How did they allow this to happen? I think there's fair questions there. Americans want answers to that. They're not going to get them. It's interesting that you made reference to Richard Nixon, because one thing that Richard Nixon did when he was president is he did his famous Nixon shocks. In response to an economic downturn, he took the USA off the gold standard, but he also imposed a wage and price freeze in response to inflation. To stop inflation, he froze the prices. So the prices of food that American working families were having to pay for, they would freeze. In order to protect working families, he did impose a price freeze. Now, I don't see the Biden administration even talking about doing this. A price freeze might actually improve things. They're not talking about it. They're just blaming Russia. And it's wild because Richard Nixon was a extreme conservative, a Republican. He viciously went after the Black Panthers and the Black Freedom Movement. He escalated the Vietnam War and bombed and killed lots of people. But Richard Nixon, to his credit, he did advocate a guaranteed minimum income for all families in the United States. And well into his administration, even in his second term, he was saying that he still believed that Americans with children should get what would be the equivalent of roughly $10,000, in a payment today. No questions asked. If you had children, you should get a payment. So as a conservative, even Richard Nixon was advocating more of a welfare state than the Democrats advocate today. Nixon's the guy who created the Environmental Protection Agency. And Nixon also is the guy who opened U.S. relations with China by going and sitting down with Mao. So even though Nixon was a hardline conservative, he was far, far to the left of anything in the Democratic Party today, especially on issues of economics.
That is extraordinary. And he also, along with Kissinger, spent a lot of time trying to keep China and Russia as far apart from each other as it was possible to do. Whereas subsequent presidents, including this one, have done everything they could to push Russia and China as close together as it's possible for them to be, which is a segue into the war in Ukraine, if you like. I said in my monologue that now no serious analyst or newspaper or military buff any longer pretends that Ukraine is winning this war. Even the Guardian conceded this week that the massive casualty numbers in the Ukrainian armed forces of perhaps up to 1,000 dead a day in the Ukrainian armed forces is tipping the war. A tipping point has now been passed in the war. Is that in any way beginning to be represented amongst the talking heads on the sofas on Sunday morning TV in America?
Well, we've seen the New York Times admit that the Ukrainian military is not sharing intelligence with the United States like the United States would like. We also have some subtle acknowledgement on the liberal side that, on the one hand, driving Russia out of every bit of territory Ukraine claims is not realistic. And on the other hand, there are a lot of questions about all these weapons and all this money that's being poured into Ukraine by the United States. And we're seeing weapons available on the black market. They're turning up for sale. We see U.S.-made weapons that instead of going into the hands of fighters are going directly onto the black market and into the hands of criminal elements that are selling them online, etc. And we had Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, as well as Elizabeth Warren, the Democratic senator from Massachusetts, calling for an inspector general to look into where these weapons are going to, because so many questions are being asked. So within the establishment, I think there is an understanding that the Biden administration policy of keeping this war going as long as possible doesn't seem to really pay off for the United States. It's wrecking the U.S. economy, and Russia is not going to surrender. But that said, you have to point to the most obvious part of the hypocrisy of this, which is that at the end of the day, they don't care about Ukrainians. They're waving the Ukrainian flags and they're saying, oh, we care about those poor Ukrainians. If you care about the Ukrainians, why are you not wanting to end this war? Why are you not pushing for negotiations to end the fighting? They are trying to prolong this war. They talk of no-fly zones. Every politician is trying to beat the drums of war harder than every other, trying to one-up themselves and how much they want to escalate this. If you care about Ukrainian lives, that's not how you would act. If you care about Ukrainian lives, you would want to negotiate. And that is not what U.S. leaders are doing. So all of their claims to care about the Ukrainian people are very cynical. They don't care about the Ukrainian people. They want to fight with Russia. This is, the Afghan trap. Once again, they're trying to draw Russia into a long-term conflict in Ukraine. They want, to bog down Russia, to cause problems for Russia's economy. That's what they're looking to do here. They want this to become a long-term conflict. And we know now, thanks to Yahoo News and other revelations, that the CIA has been in Ukraine for the past 5 years plotting to turn this country into a battlefield. Now, if you're plotting to turn someone's country into a battlefield, if you're plotting to have a long-term proxy war in a country, that shows you don't care about the people there. That's not love for the Ukrainian people. And we shouldn't let them get away with this hypocrisy.
Caleb Maupin, as always, a pleasure to talk to you on the mother of all talk shows. Thanks for joining us.